Hello and welcome to part 2 of this PlayStation episode in the cancelled game series. Here we're taking a look at another 15 and a total of 30 unreleased games for Sony's debut console, although there are loads more out there. A big thank you once again to the official PlayStation Museum who recorded some of the footage especially for this episode, which is hugely appreciated. If you're into the PlayStation, their site has some fascinating reading and is linked in the description. Let me know in the comments which games you think look promising and which are probably best left on the scrap heap. So without further ado, here are another 15 cancelled PlayStation games. Sorcery started out conceptually as a fantasy spellcasting game, but Sony decided to change it to an arena fighter due to hardware limitations and concerns over its potential profitability versus that of a fighting game. The original concept sounds intriguing actually. It was inspired by Magic the Gathering and would have featured 30 playable characters of various fantasy classes, including werewolves, dwarves and fairies. 2 opponents would battle it out split screen in a huge play area, casting spells, setting magical traps and summoning creatures. The development team loved Magic the Gathering and wanted to bring the same feel to a PlayStation game. The project was certainly an ambitious one, but Sony's decision to dial it back to being just an arena brawler was a bizarre one. I feel that they should have just cut their losses at that point. From the footage it looks extremely basic at this point and seems to have only standard attacks, but the sparkle of what might be magic is present, so presumably the fighting game would have retained the ability to cast spells. I mean, it was still called Sorcery after all. After being developed for around 2 years during 97 and 98, it was cancelled altogether, resulting in a loss of at least $1 million. The playable prototype looks absolutely abysmal, so it's probably for the best, but a shame that Sorcery's original vision was never realised. Konami brought some of their franchises that had seen success on the MSX over to the PlayStation and gave them the CD quality treatment, the most obvious being Metal Gear. They also plan to release a PlayStation version of the MSX's Konami Hyper Rally, simply called Konami Rally. Konami announced it at 99Z3 along with an upcoming Game Boy Color version. Although the latter did end up being released in 2000 as cross-country racing, the PlayStation version of Konami Rally never emerged at all. I was a huge fan of these arcade-style rally games back in the original PlayStation games with the likes of V-Rally and Colin McRae, so would have welcomed Konami having a bash at the genre. Having said that, although the footage looks nice and smooth in terms of frame rate, it's unclear what, if anything, this would have brought to rally games that we didn't already have. All we have of this one is a concept video, but Hellcatraz Escape from the Rock was to be a first-person action game in which the objective was to escape from San Francisco's infamous island prison, Alcatraz. And sadly, that's all we know. Not much to go on, I know, but I thought it was a really interesting concept for a game nonetheless. Rattlesnake Red was a planned 3D action platformer being developed by Sculptured Software and to be published by Acclaim. You play as Red, a red-haired axe-wielding southerner, as he explores the game's desert canyon landscape. The landscapes are similar to those you might find in southwestern states like Arizona, complete with canyons, rivers and abandoned mines, and are populated with equally typical enemy wildlife such as rattlesnakes and scorpions. The game had 8 levels combining platforming, combat and puzzle solving, which typically involve finding a way around an obstacle in Red's path. In combat, Red has various moves at his disposal and could also collect power-ups. There's no elaborate story to Rattlesnake Red's cancellation, it was simply a casualty of Acclaim culling its portfolio of games in development. The Contract was a third-person action adventure game from Psygnosis in which you would take control of one of 2 mob heavies, Simon and Natasha. The pair are working for the Mafia and set out on a mission to avenge the Kaluska family who have been wronged in some way. The game is to take place over 30 missions, which would vary considerably in terms of gameplay depending on which playable character was chosen. It's unclear how much of the game would revolve around stealth and how much would be all guns blazing action, but perhaps each mission would allow the player to choose their own approach. Psygnosis were reportedly aiming for a big budget action movie vibe, so perhaps it would lean towards the action-oriented gameplay style. It boasted 50 weapons and 20 stealth moves. I'm not sure why, but the contract was cancelled halfway through development. Marvel 2099 One Nation Under Doom was a side-scrolling action game being developed by Sapphire and to be published in 1996 by Mindscape. The only footage I can find of this one is this monstrosity, so I'll be brief on the game so you don't go blind. Based on Marvel's 2099 comic book series, the game would have featured 8 playable characters, including the 2099 versions of Spider-Man, Daredevil, the Punisher, the Hulk, the Thing, Ghost Rider, and at least one of the X-Men. It's a 2D side-scrolling brawler, but the characters are rendered in 3D. Seemingly Mindscape were distributing promotional materials for the game, and a demo was shown at 96's E3 featuring one playable Punisher level. Soon after this, Mindscape cancelled all of their upcoming console titles, including Marvel 2099. The footage isn't much to go on, but a side-scroller based on the Marvel 2099 series would have certainly piqued my interest. Saboteur was an action game from Tygon Software being developed in 1998 and 99 for the PlayStation and PC to be published by Eidos. Described by the developers as an arcade adventure game, Saboteur had a 3D fighting system that seems quite advanced for a game of this type considering the era. It reminds me a little of Shenmue, which started out as a Virtua Fighter RPG in that it combines 3D adventure game exploration and a fully realised combat system. You take on the role of Shin, a ninja in Japan set in the present day or near future. His sister has been kidnapped by a huge corporation and he's out to rescue her and exact some violent revenge. Shin has his trusty katana at his disposal and can also make use of shuriken and bombs. As any ninja must, Shin needs to employ stealth to successfully take on his enemies, hiding in the shadows to choose the right time to strike or to avoid confrontation altogether. A nice touch is his companion, his dog Shiro. Shiro can be given commands and will attack enemies and can even be used as a lookout. Saboteur boasted a rich story and deep character development and sophisticated enemy AI which would adapt to the player's fighting style. The project was soon passed from Tygon to Pumpkin Studios, but not long after that Eidos decided to cease all PlayStation development. After all, this was in 1999, so the PS2's release was looming, so Saboteur was cancelled. A real pity as this looks so promising. The little gameplay footage we have looks wicked, but I'm just not sure about the name Saboteur, it doesn't really fit. Bioswarm aka Battlesport 2 was a planned sequel to Battlesport, which came to Windows and PlayStation in North America and PAL regions, and the Saturn and 3DO in North America only. It's also known as Groundwave and NRG, or Nasty Radioactive Garbage. Being developed in 97 and 98 by Cyclone Studios, it was a sci-fi vehicular combat game. In its original form as Battlesport 2, the game was very similar to the original, which was like a futuristic sports game in which the objective was to get a ball into a goal, but it was heavily based on combat. The combat element was to be even more prevalent in the sequel, making it more of an arena combat game. The story sees living toxic waste arrive on Earth somehow, which mutates inanimate objects and makes them alive. You take control of one of various available ships and battle these living machines who have AI that maneuver in flocking flight patterns. The game could be played in either first or third person, and the 5 levels could be played in any order, despite them increasing in difficulty, so there would be nothing to stop you from playing the hardest levels first. Cyclone Studios created a playable demo for 98's E3, but it wasn't shown in the end. In April that year, Cyclone was absorbed by 3DO, and Bioswarm, or whatever it was called at the time, was cancelled. A PlayStation port of Epic's futuristic first-person shooter Unreal was being developed by Pterodactyl Software and would be published by Infogrames. This version was to feature some new weapons and levels, although the levels had to be scaled down for the hardware. 2 beta levels were developed containing missions from the latter half of the game. Being the poster boy for the Unreal Engine, the game looks really fluid and quite impressive considering it's a PlayStation game. Sadly, the hardware restrictions meant that very few enemies could be on screen at once, and there were also limitations in the number of polygons per level and number of visible polygons per room. For these reasons, the port had a higher emphasis on puzzle solving and platforming than the original. The developers also structured the levels in such a way that the player would revisit certain areas, creating the illusion of a larger level. I've no idea why, but Infogrames cancelled Unreal at some point. Jet Moto 2124 was a planned fourth instalment in Sony's Jet Moto, or Jet Rider in Europe, series. Like its predecessors, it's a futuristic racing game in which you pilot hoverbikes. It would have 16 hoverbikes from which to choose. Unlike the first 3 games, the tracks wouldn't be limited to Earth, instead being located in 10 different worlds across the solar system, including Jupiter, Mars and Earth's moon. At first glance, this looks like just another Jet Moto game and therefore perhaps a bit pointless, but it would have actually had some significant improvements. The developers were redesigning the physics engine and increasing the speed to produce, quote, the Jet Moto feel but with wipeout speed. It would also add the ability to perform in-air motocross style tricks. Because of this, Jet Moto 2124 had 2 game modes, one with standard races and one stunt competition. The racing mode featured several power-ups from turbos to offensive weaponry. Unfortunately, these high speeds caused unforeseen issues with the physics and camera angles, and the team were working on numerous tweaks and changes to compensate for these flaws. Jet Moto 3's sales weren't particularly noteworthy, and the studio's new president was dubious about the need for a 4th instalment of the franchise. For these reasons, among others, Jet Moto 2124 was cancelled 2 years into its development. It's always tragic hearing about these cancelled games when you consider the developers who worked hard on them fruitlessly. This is no exception. The team believed that this would have been the best Jet Moto game yet, and saw the franchise transitioning to the PS2 and eventually the PS3 in the future. Now, technically, a game called Apocalypse starring Bruce Willis, developed by Neversoft and published by Activision, was released, but it wasn't this one. The original Apocalypse was a much grander vision. Originally, Bruce Willis's character Trey Kincaid was going to be a sidekick to your main playable character, known simply as the Kid. It boasted an elaborate 3D environment, cinematic gameplay with multiple dynamic camera angles, and seamlessly transitioning FMV cutscenes. The project was way too ambitious for the hardware, but Activision had paid a shed load of cash to Bruce Willis for his likeness, reportedly several million, so scrapping it entirely wasn't an option. By the time they approached Neversoft, they needed the game out within 9 months, which Neversoft realised was unachievable. Instead, they completely redesigned the game into a more straightforward 3D action shooter and changed it to a one-man system with Bruce Willis as the main player character, which makes more sense to be honest considering how much they paid him. Apart from the general story and a few minor graphical assets, Neversoft scrapped everything from the original concept. RazorWing was a planned first-person vehicle-based shooter from N-Space to be published by Sony and was in development in 1995. Details are thin on the ground here. I'm unsure of the exact story or setting, but there's definitely a military theme. The terrain doesn't give much away. It could be set on Earth or another desert planet, but for me the terrain and ships give the game a Dune-like vibe. Wherever it's set, it's clearly in the future and has at least a modicum of science fiction. RazorWing incorporated several technological advancements for the time, including a high-res mode. It was shown in a playable form at E3 in '95. Despite being a mere 3 months away from completion, it was cancelled. It's speculated that this was due to the release of Warhawk, which came out the same year and was also published by Sony, but personally I think the similarities are minor, besides them both being vehicle-based shooters. Only screenshots of RazorWing existed until July 2017 when a playable prototype was discovered. Forgive the awful quality of the footage here, it's from a VHS recording of manga magazine V-Jump's festival in 1995. Twinbee Miracle was to be an RPG based on Konami's Twinbee series, which of course are vertical shooters. An interesting choice for Konami, and I wonder if this would have been released outside of Japan had it been released at all. A 2D turn-based JRPG, Twinbee Miracle was due for release in '96 to coincide with Twinbee's 10th anniversary. From what we can see in the footage, it looks like it was a fair way along, and looks great actually, combining the traditional Japanese RPG format with the cute-em-up graphical style for which Twinbee was known. For whatever reason it was cancelled, and although Twinbee did eventually get an RPG on the PlayStation in '98 simply titled Twinbee RPG, this was an entirely different game. Come to think of it, that was released in Japan only, so I'd imagine the same would have been true of Twinbee Miracle. Team Ico's first game and namesake, started development on the PlayStation in 1998. The game was quite different from anything else available at the time, as several of the team hadn't worked in the video game industry before. They wanted to make a game that steered away from conventional gaming practices and created a consistent artistic experience. The project was worked on for around 2 years when they hit a wall with the original PlayStation's capabilities, so it was a case of scrapping Ico altogether or shifting onto the PS2. Thankfully, the latter option was chosen. From this demo footage from the PlayStation version, we can see some distinct differences, like Yorda sporting horns instead of Ico, but this was switched in the final PS2 version to make Ico more instantly distinguishable. In the end, Ico went through a 4-year development cycle, and the end result was certainly worth it. Dream Team Basketball was to be based on the '96 USA Olympic basketball team. The early to mid 90s was a golden age for basketball, and being a lifelong basketball fan, I could bang on about the original '92 Dream Team for hours, but don't worry, I'll spare you. To cut a long story short, the Dream Team got its name because every country entering the Olympics was allowed to use professionals except the USA, which hardly seemed fair. The '92 Olympics in Barcelona was the first one to see this rule changed, so they put together an absolute beast of a team, the likes of which had never been seen, and they absolutely trounced the competition. 4 years later they had an equally impressive team featuring legends such as Charles Barkley, Shaq, Scottie Pippen and Hakeem the Dream Olajuwon. US Gold planned to release Dream Team Basketball to coincide with the '96 Olympics in Atlanta, but for some reason it never came. For a relatively early PlayStation title, the animations are pretty good. You can build a team from each country's available players, and it had several options for customising the game rules. The USA's '96 Dream Team dominated the Olympics just like the '92 team had, and sadly this is the same for the game. So if you play as the USA, the game's just far too easy, which is a bit of a design flaw. This footage, supplied by the PlayStation Museum, is about 70% complete, but it's unknown if Dream Team Basketball was ever finished. So that was the latter 15 of 30 of the many unreleased PlayStation games. Let me know if any of them tickle your fancy, and as always, thanks for watching. If you want to see more of my cancelled games series, here's the playlist.